Sharon, it's so great to be here with you this morning in Toronto. Thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you. Such a privilege for me.
So I want to start by asking you if you could take me through your journey into medicine. How is it that you became a geriatrician?
Great question. How long do we have? So I never really knew that I wanted to go into medicine at all. It was just something that, as I went through school, it was kind of always in the back of my mind. But initially I thought I wanted to be a lawyer and maybe go into politics one day. And that kind of fell by the wayside. But one of the things that I had when I was growing up, I had amazing parents who didn't have a lot of opportunities. And they always wanted my sister, my brother, and I to have choices. And one of the things that they said is, do whatever you want that's going to make you happy, and we will support you. And they did. And one of the things that it allowed me to do was to try and explore different things. And one of the things that I started doing when I was in high school, I volunteered in a long-term care home. And the reason I started doing that was because I always loved visiting my great-grandfather, who was in a veterans home. And when I was growing up, and I thought, well, I want to try and volunteer in a long-term care home. And I fell in love with older adults, and subsequently then decided to go into medical school, and it just kind of went from there. But I've never really done anything in my career. It sounds really strange, but planning ahead and thinking, okay, I'm going to do this, and this. It was always just kind of following my interests and where I thought I could maybe make an impact.
And so going from your clinical work to the leadership roles that you hold now, what was that path like? How did it evolve?
So again, it was nothing intentional. I always say I'm the poster child for not being focused and not kind of going in with a plan in mind and thinking, when we were in medical school, there were all those people that said, I want to be a cardiologist in day one, and they always knew what they wanted to do. And, and they just kind of went bang, 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 bang. And I never really kind of thought that way. And I always wished that I could have, but it was just kind of, leaving yourself open to opportunities and thinking about where you could maybe make a difference. And I started off doing my clinical training. So I did internal medicine and then geriatric medicine. And then I started research training, became a researcher. But one of the things that's interesting about research is that you develop skills along the way, like managing people, because you manage a research team and budgets and contracts and things. And then for some reason, people think then that you should be a leader and, that you've got kind of something that, you've got the skill set, so then maybe you could be a leader. And I remember, so I'd led my research program, but I remember I was recruited back to Toronto from Calgary, and Wendy Levinson was the chair of medicine in Toronto at the time. And she took me out for breakfast one day and she said, I want you to apply to be the division director for geriatric medicine. And I said, no, it's not something that I would be good at. And I didn't really see myself doing that. And she asked me why. And I went through kind of my list about, why I didn't think I would be good for the role, and, that somebody else could do it so much better. Somebody with expertise in education, and because you really needed to build a pathway for people into geriatrics, because we'd had many years where nobody was going into geriatric medicine, and the morale wasn't great and things. And she went through one by one over that breakfast and said, well, this is why I disagree with you. This is why I disagree with you. So it's funny. I was recently doing a back and forth email with Wendy, and I said, I blame you. Yeah, it's all your fault. For me ending up in kind of these different leadership roles, because that was the first kind of, non-research leadership role. I mean, I'd done research leadership roles along the way, but that was kind of the first non-research.
The gateway role.
Yeah, exactly. The gateway role. And it then led to, I went from doing that to then being vice chair of medicine at the University of Toronto and creating a new portfolio in mentorship, equity, and diversity. And then from there, becoming, I was deputy PIC at St. Mike's Hospital, and then PIC. And now I'm taking on a new role. So it's interesting because, I don't think if I'd if I hadn't had that conversation with her, I don't think I would have kind of gone down that pathway. And again, like each subsequent role after that, it wasn't like I looked at that next job and thought, that's what I want to do next. It was just, you see things that come up and people explore it and ask you to think about it.
Yeah, the natural evolution of things as opposed to trying to script things that maybe aren't easily scripted.
Well, and that's the thing, but I think that's one of the, like that, to me, being in medicine is such a privilege, and being in academic medicine is such a privilege, because our career can do all these twists and turns, right? And we can do different things, from, 1 year to the next, we can change our jobs and explore different opportunities. And it's such a privilege. Like who else has that, where they can do all those different things? Like it's such a gift.
And we become almost desensitized to it, I think, as you say that. And that's what I find myself thinking, that we almost no longer see it because we take that for granted.
It's true. And you're so right. And, that's, again, one of the things that I love about our friendship is that, we always have those moments where you think, wow, like it's, how lucky are we to be, number one, in medicine, number two, to be in academic medicine, and number three, to have, all these different choices.
We can constantly sort of be moving on to something else and staying fresh.
Exactly.
That way.
Exactly.
I want to ask you about mentorship, because that is, of course, one of your areas of expertise. You've had a really important mentor. I know you've had many, but there's one in particular that I am thinking of. Could you talk a bit about?
Yeah, no, for sure. So after I finished my clinical training, I started my research training in clinical epidemiology. And kind of typical, when you're finished your training at U of T, they always tell you to go away for a while, right? And try and develop your career and things. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do at that point. I think I've already kind of alluded to the fact that I've never known what I want to do. I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. But I think one of the things that I was interested in was, because I started my research training in clin-epi, but I hadn't fallen in love with it, and I wasn't sure if it was the right path for me. And I thought, well, maybe I should reach out to the person who kind of wrote the definitive textbook of clin-epi. And Dave Sackett had been at McMaster and kind of one of the founders with John Evans of the, not just the school, but the first clin-epi and biostats department. And so he had just moved to Oxford to set up a new center. And I didn't know him, but I'd read all about, like he'd done, the textbook that I mentioned, so many trials and things like that in medicine. And so I emailed him and said, I have a research fellowship that I'm exploring. Are you open to taking any fellows? And he responded in about 5 minutes and said, sure, come on over. And I learned afterwards that was kind of his style. So I went thinking I would go for maybe a year, and I ended up staying for almost 4 years, because it was where I really fell in love with research. And one of the things that he did was, the first night that I met him. So he and his wife Barbara Sackett, who is, again, has been a mentor in my career as well. The two of them took me out for dinner to the Trout Pub, which is also known as the Morse Pub because of the Colin Dexter novels. But they took me out for dinner, and Dave sat me down and he said, what do you want in your career and in your life? And so I told him, and he said, okay, it's my job to help you achieve that. And I will do whatever I can to make sure that you realize your dream. And my first response, and I know I've told you this before, was I didn't believe him. Right?
Sounds too good to be true.
Exactly. And you thought, well, nobody can be that altruistic, right? Like there's got to be something else. Like he's going to say it but not mean it. And one of the things that I learned over time was that he didn't just say it, but he lived it, and he meant it. And no matter what, along the time that I spent with him, it was always about, what did I want in my career and how could he help support me in that. The only thing he ever asked me in return was that I do the same thing for others. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, again, was a very powerful moment, because, your mentors and your supervisors can ask you to do lots of scuddy things, right? Like we've all experienced that with supervisors and things. but he didn't. It was always about wanting to make sure that, he provided me with opportunities. He never told me what to do. He just posed the questions, posed those questions that stimulated you to reflect, right? And so to me, that was something that was quite important. And so then when he said, I want you to do the same thing for others, that's when I really started to panic because
This is a big job.
I know, exactly. And I mean, as you know, I'm a geek, and especially around data and things. And I thought, well, how do I do that? Like, how do I learn? How do I become a mentor? Because he was really my first mentor, and it took me a really long time to get to that point, right? To find somebody like him. And so I thought, like, why is he that way? And what is it that, makes a good mentor? And so then, as you know, I started doing some research because then I was starting to panic and trying to figure out like what it is to be a good mentor. How do you become a good mentor? Realizing that, some people I think are just born to be good mentors, but the rest of us can kind of learn things along the way, and hopefully we can become, a better mentor than what we started off in.
So we focus a lot in this series on wellness. And so one of the questions I want to ask you about mentorship, we all know that having an amazing mentor helps our wellness as a mentee, but what do you see as some of the benefits from a wellness perspective in being a mentor? How has it been shown to be helpful?
Yeah. And that's a great question because a lot of the literature exactly focuses on the benefits for the mentee, but there is a growing literature showing the benefits to the mentor. And in particular, it keeps the mentor stimulated and interested and enthusiastic. Like there's no better feeling in the world than when your mentee does something well, when they do a great teaching session or you see them do their first clinical case presentation, right? Like there's no better feeling than seeing your mentee do well. And I think it's underestimated sometimes how much of an impact that makes on the mentor and how much we gain from that. Like we gain far more from the relationship. And it's funny because a lot of times when I do mentorship workshops, mentees say to me, I don't want to bother my, a mentor and, they're so busy, what if I reach out and, they're too busy? And I always say like, what's the worst that could happen? If you want to reach out to somebody and ask about mentorship, the worst thing that could happen is that they either don't respond or they say no. But I said, but it's a compliment when somebody reaches out to you and says, can we talk about, whether we could explore a mentoring relationship? I said, like, that's a huge compliment to say to somebody that, I value what you do and, and I would like to learn with you. Like, to me, that's a huge compliment. And, maybe it doesn't always work out that you can provide that to that individual, but the opportunity to explore it is fantastic.
Love that. And I want to pivot now to talking about wellness in leadership. So we, of course, both know that there is a body of literature that suggests that leaders who take better care of themselves are also more effectively able to lead and model those behaviors for the people they lead. What does that look like for you? What's sort of your approach to your own well-being in medicine?
Yeah. So I think it's a really important question because I think that people, it is important to role model. And I think that, we can talk about, telling people, I always say, I can tell people, take time off in the summer, make sure you schedule regular vacations, don't answer emails unless, unless it's urgent. Like, you can talk about all of those things, but I think it's also important to role model. But I also worry about, it's funny, just as one small example, we were talking about, do you answer emails on the weekend or not? Or do you schedule them so that then they all get sent out on Monday morning? So it sounds like such a small thing, but it was interesting because we were talking about it recently and we were saying that it's actually, for some people, it's actually more stressful not to respond on the weekend because then they draft it, put it in their outbox, schedule it, but then they don't know that it's actually gone out. And then they panic. And then they end up spending more time as opposed to answering it in the moment and instead saying, I'm answering now. It doesn't mean I expect you to answer, and just kind of leaving it like that. But I think it's down to the individual to figure out what works for them and what's going to make them most comfortable. But also setting the expectations that, just because I'm doing this doesn't mean you have to do this. And we all have to find that balance. And I also think it's important for people to think about, what are what are the things outside of medicine, outside of our jobs that, that keep us interested and excited. And I think sometimes it's really difficult because most of us love what we do, right? And like we were saying, like it's such a privilege and we get such joy from what we do. Like I always say I have the best job in the world, and I'm happy when I go into work every day. Like I love the challenge, and I love seeing patients, and I love interacting with learners, and I love doing research and things. And so sometimes it's hard because we get so caught up in that. But you also realize that, you have so many other things outside of that too that you have to, and that you should keep going. And, obviously family, obviously friends, other interests that you have, like it's so important. And I think that to me is the key thing. But, I saw that in you from when you were a resident, like I don't know anybody who had as many talents as you. And as many things that you could have done. And you always found time for those different things, and, and maybe not always in the balance that you wanted and in the mix that you wanted, but you never lost sight of them along the way. And I thought, you were always a role model for me for that.
Oh, that's so kind. And actually, I did lose sight of them plenty of times.
But you picked them up.
Yeah. And it was in that, as you say, it was sort of in that moment of seeing what am I like when I don't do the things that nourish and sustain me. I'm a much less interesting person. I'm a much less refreshed person at the bedside. And also, one interesting insight, too, for me was that patients are really gratified when we have other pieces of ourselves. It sort of gives us additional ways to connect with them.
Exactly.
They're curious about us too, of course.
Exactly. And I think that's such an important point because it allows us to, establish a connection a lot of times with people. Because one of the fantastic things about being a physician, I think, is we have such intimate relationships with patients. We learn things, we know things, we develop these relationships with them, and sometimes just terrible circumstances, right? And and you're with them through sad times, but also incredibly happy times, and it is like such a privilege. But you also you have those opportunities to develop those connections because you can talk about different things, like about like when Alice Munro died recently. I remember talking to a patient about, because we were talking about it that day, and we were talking about kind of, the impact that it had on us, and in our favorite book, and it's that connection, right? That you just think, wow, it's like we're really lucky to have that.
Yeah, and it's part of the foundation, I think, is what I hear in what you're saying of how we build fulsome relationships with people.
Exactly, it's building those connections with people that, again, like if I wasn't in medicine, I don't know that I would have been able to, develop these connections with all these different people, right?
So, Sharon, you were a leader at St. Mike's during the most critical phase of the pandemic. You're still obviously in a leadership role, just changing portfolios. What are some of the thoughts that you have right now about the well-being of the people that you lead as we sort of move from this acute phase into the chronic state of unrest that healthcare seems to be in at this moment in time? How do you look out for people's well-being?
Yeah, I think that's one of the toughest questions, and it's the thing that probably worries me the most. Is how to support people through this time, how to make sure that that they have what they need to succeed and to be fulfilled and to be happy in what they're doing, because it is like during COVID it was a very different context because you went from one problem to the next to the next to the next, and now it's just dealing with all the aftermath and the chaos of the healthcare system and all the changes in the health human workforce challenges, and that everybody's tired, and but also everything else that's going on in the world, and and all the sadness in the world, and trying to support people and through this period. And to me, I think it's really about making sure that we stay focused on the patients and really why we're here, as well as the learners, because between the patients and the learners, that's kind of why we do what we do, and making sure that that we stay focused on that. And to be able to do the best job for them, we have to be well, and we have to be happy in what we're doing. So I think it's about always trying to maintain our focus on that, and also realizing that there are going to be ups and downs. There's going to be, we're going to continue to have challenges. To me, it's about providing that hope for the future, and to think that, out of chaos, good things can happen. And I know probably I'm naive, but I truly do think and have hope for the future that good things can happen, out of challenging times, because it's also the opportunity for us to be creative, and to think about things differently. And, what could healthcare look like? Yeah. 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. What could our education systems look like in the future? What does the health human workforce look like in the future? To me, it's about, this stimulates creativity. And it's probably, one of the things that I love about research is because we always can think about, how are we going to solve this? How are we going to kind of move forward? And to me, the reason I went into research, and it goes back to the patient, is because everything begins and ends with patients. And so that to me is how I hope that we can move through this to a better future, I hope, for our patients, for all of us.
When you talk about that centrality of the patient, one of the things it makes me think about is just how deeply relational you are in your approach to leadership, in your approach to clinical medicine, in everything that you do. And at this moment in time, with all the world events that we are dealing with, all the collective trauma, the heightened emotions, reactivity, and many differing perspectives, how do we preserve relationships? What are some of your thoughts on that as a leader?
Yeah. Such an important question. It's something I think that everybody's struggling with right now. But I think it's about, and there, again, one of the things that I think is fantastic about in kind of the world we live in is people have different perspectives, and we may not always agree with them, and they may challenge us sometimes to think about things differently. And to me, that's fantastic. I love that people come in with different perspectives, and they challenge me to think about things differently, and they challenge us to be better and to do better. And I think that one of the things that I would hope to see happen is that we maintain that ability to communicate our differences in a collegial, a civil way, a kind way, a compassionate way, so that we can hear from each other, that we can learn from each other, because that's what being an academic is. It's about being open to different ideas, that people will always think differently. I mean, look at through history, people thought differently through time, and isn't that great? But I think one of the things that that we have to do is just realize it's making that connection with that one person that's sitting in front of us, and how best can we make that connection? And we may not agree on things, but that's okay. We will still find a way to connect and to communicate and to care for that patient who's sitting in front of us.
Now, if I was thinking about what is in your well-being toolkit, if I were to rate it, one of the things I would observe is that you are one of the most grateful people I know. And I wonder if you could talk about how you see gratitude as being a helpful outlook, helpful practice in terms of maintaining well-being under really difficult circumstances.
I think it's such an important piece, because for me, it's what keeps me, alive and going, is to think about, how fortunate, to be able to do this. And, and especially, again, going back to, my parents. My dad had to quit school at grade 10, because of, came from a large family, and his mother had died. And, and my mother, that she didn't have the career choices that I did. And so, I always thought that, for me to have different choices than what they had, like, how incredibly grateful I am for that, right? That they provided that for me. And I think, so I really learned from them the importance of, recognizing that and being grateful. Because a lot of times it's easy to say, oh, I wish I had that, or I wish I did that, or whatever. But it's about, taking those moments and thinking, like, it keeps me nourished every day. Like, and thinking about, like, how, like, coming here this morning to talk to you, I'm incredibly grateful. I said, to have the opportunity to, to spend Sunday morning with you, to chat, because, again, it's something that nourishes you, right? And it keeps you going. It keeps you interested. And I think, bringing gratitude into everything that we do every patient encounter, every time we see a patient, you learn something. They stimulate us to learn something because every patient leads to a question that, and sometimes we don't know the answer, and that can be a research question. And sometimes then we look it up and then we can talk about it with the patient. But how amazing is that it's a learning opportunity, like we get to learn. And so I think it's about finding those moments. And to me, that's a wellness strategy because otherwise, it's very easy to, I think sometimes in medicine, to become desensitized and instead of recognizing, these are all gifts that we have, that we should be grateful for.
I love how you framed that as strategy, because I think so often we think of it as a trait. And I mean, maybe to some degree it is a trait, but it's also something we can quite intentionally augment and develop as a skill and a strategic piece of how we see the world. It makes me think of when Adam Grant talks about task perception. Am I going to see another consult that was unnecessary, or am I going to help someone and provide relief and care? And the framing for each of those situations changes the way we feel about the task as we're engaged in it.
Exactly. And it's so funny that you raise that, because it's also, the other thing that, sometimes, people might frame it as a consult, I can't believe they're asking me, this question. And another way to frame it is they're reaching out because they don't know what to do in this situation. And isn't it great that we can potentially help? Like that's fantastic, right? And yes, I know that, maybe it's the 10th consult you're getting that day, but it's thinking about, what is it that we can that we can be grateful for, and this person, there's a reason they asked for a consult. They're struggling with something, and they're struggling with knowing what to do for this particular patient.
The thing you make me think about there too is compassion for others and compassion for our colleagues. We often are better at generating compassion for patients, and mediocre, not too poor, to generating compassion for ourselves. But we often really fail in the department of offering compassion to one another. What are your thoughts on how we can begin to mitigate that professionally?
I think it's a really important topic to reflect on because I do think it's something that we should be role modeling with our learners, and recognizing, that there's a paucity of compassion sometimes in our interactions with people. And especially I think as in the clinical context, because you're so busy, and sometimes it leads to we always talk about turf wars, like who's gonna take this consult, those kinds of things. And I think it's kind of recognizing those times and realizing that if we want to be compassionate to patients, we have to be compassionate to each other as well.
Sharon, the last thing I want to say to you today is everywhere I go across Canada, somebody will come up to me and say, Sharon Straus, she's been one of my mentors too. And it's literally an endless stream of people that you've mentored and supported. And like the best psychiatrist, you have the ability to make everybody feel like it's just them. So I can only imagine how many people today are in the same boat as me, hearing you talk and thinking about the incredible and almost indescribable impact that you've had on their career and their lives. So I just want to say how grateful I am, and thank you so much to you. It's just been a joy to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. And if I have impacted anybody in their career, I can only say thank you to them and thank you to you, because again, it's a gift, and I learn from every interaction, and it's a privilege, to spend this time with you. So thank you.
Thank you.